Every word spoken and every action taken leaves a silver echo that resonates through the digital halls of our shared history. We follow these echoes to find the lessons and the legacies that still matter to us today. Subscribe now and listen to the stories that refuse to fade. The night my son handed me that envelope, I remember thinking it was the kindest thing he had ever done for me. It was a Thursday in late September, one of those evenings where the light over Lake Ontario turns amber, and the air carries just enough chill to remind you that winter is coming. My son had driven up from Toronto with his wife, and we sat together at the kitchen table, where I had eaten 1,000 meals alone since my wife Margaret passed 3 years ago. He slid the envelope across the table with both hands, almost ceremonially, and when I opened it, I found a printed itinerary for a 10-day wilderness retreat in the Yukon. A fully guided trip. Fly fishing along the Teslin River. A private cabin. Meals provided. Everything arranged. "You've been working in that garage every single day since Mum died," my son said. "You need this, Dad. You deserve to rest." I looked at the brochure inside. Photographs of spruce forests and gray-green rivers and mountains that looked like they had never been touched by human hands. I felt something loosen in my chest that I had not realized was tight. "This must have cost a fortune," I said. My son waved his hand. "Don't worry about it. Just go. Please." His wife was smiling at me from across the table with that particular smile she'd always worn around me, warm enough on the surface but never quite reaching her eyes. I had noticed it for years without ever saying anything. Married people carry their private languages, and I had always assumed that whatever tension existed between us was simply the ordinary friction between a father-in-law and a daughter-in-law who were too different to ever be fully comfortable with each other. I had never thought it was anything more than that. I thanked them both. I told my son it was the most thoughtful gift anyone had given me since his mother was alive. He squeezed my shoulder when he left, and I stood on the porch and watched their car back down the driveway and disappear around the corner of Ashford Road. I went inside and made myself a cup of tea and sat looking at the itinerary for a long time. I was 64 years old. I had spent 31 years as a civil litigation attorney in Hamilton, Ontario. I had built a career on reading situations carefully, on noticing what people did not say as much as what they did. It was a professional habit that had never fully left me, even in retirement. In sitting there alone in my kitchen, something about the evening nagged at me in a way I could not immediately name. My son had never been the type to make grand gestures, not out of coldness. He was not a coldness. He was not a sense in practicality he had inherited from me. Birthday cards were always signed, simply. Christmas gifts were always sensible. A 10-day private wilderness retreat was not sensible. It was extravagant in a way that felt slightly off-key, like a note played just a fraction sharp. I told myself I was being ungrateful. I went to bed. 2 days later, I came back from my morning walk earlier than expected, because a cold front had moved in off the lake and I had forgotten my heavier jacket. I came in through the side door quietly, the way I always did when the weather was bad, and I heard my son's voice from the living room. I had not known he was there. His car had not been in the driveway. I stopped in the hallway. He was on the phone. I could only hear his half of the conversation, but his voice had a quality I had never heard from him before, low and controlled in the way that people speak when they are trying to manage someone who is nervous. "It's confirmed for the 14th, he said. "The river section, yes. He'll ask for the full day. He always pushes himself on that kind of thing." A pause. It has to look like an exposure accident, hypothermia, or a fall in the water. The guide knows that area better than anyone. Nobody is going to ask questions about an old man going under in the Teslin in October. I stood completely still in the hallway. My hand was flat against the wall. I could feel the plaster cold under my palm. The policy and the estate together? Yes. That's why it has to be clean. Another pause. I know. Just make sure he actually gets on the plane." He ended the call. I heard him shift on the couch. I moved back toward the side door as quietly as I'd come in, eased it open, stepped outside, and stood on the side porch in the cold air for a very long time. I am a man who spent his career dealing with betrayal, estates contested between siblings, business partners who had known each other for decades turning on one another over money. I had sat across the table from more than a few clients who had come to me, still shaking from the discovery that someone they loved had been lying to them for years. I had always felt genuine sympathy for those clients while also privately maintaining a certain professional distance from their shock. I had understood it intellectually without ever feeling it myself. Standing on that side porch, I understood it in a completely different way. My son was 64 years old. My son was 34. I had coached his hockey teams. I had driven him to university. I had lent him the down payment on his first house without ever once asking for it back. I had held him at his mother's funeral and felt his shoulders shake. And he had just arranged for someone to drown me in a river in the Yukon. The cold off the lake was sharp, and I stood there until I felt steady enough to go back inside. I waited until I heard him leave. About 20 minutes later, through the front door, his car starting in the street, I went inside and sat at the kitchen table, and I thought. The rational response was to call the police. I knew that. But I had spent 3 decades in civil litigation working alongside criminal defense attorneys, and I understood precisely what the police could and could not do with what I had. I had heard half of one phone conversation in my own home. There was no recording, no corroboration. My son would say I had misheard, misunderstood, that he had been talking about a work matter or a film or anything else that a capable defense lawyer could make plausible to a jury. The guide in the Yukon was a stranger I could not identify. The plan, at this stage, was not a crime they could charge. It was a conversation. I needed evidence. Real evidence. The kind that would hold. And there was another problem, one that any lawyer would recognize immediately. My son and his wife were the sole beneficiaries of my estate and the named recipients on my life insurance policy, a policy worth just under $900,000, taken out years ago when Margaret was still alive and the world had seemed simpler. If I changed the will and removed them now, before I had any evidence, they would know immediately that something had shifted. I did not know how they would react to that. I did not know how desperate they were, or how quickly desperation could change a plan. I needed to be careful. I called the only person I trusted completely, which was my brother-in-law Robert, Margaret's younger brother, who had been a Royal Canadian Mounted Police officer for 22 years before his retirement. He lived outside of Guelph, and he picked up on the second ring. I told him everything. He was quiet for a long time after I finished. "You're not going to like what I'm about to say," he said. "Tell me anyway. You have to go on the trip." I had already been thinking the same thing, which was the only reason I did not refuse immediately. "If you go," Robert said, "and you go prepared, you can document everything. You can record the guide's behavior, collect physical evidence of intent, and come back with something a Crown attorney can actually use. If you don't go, they regroup and try again in 6 months with a plan you won't see coming. And if something goes wrong while I'm there—" "Nothing is going to go wrong," he said, "because I'm going to help you make sure of that." Robert had contacts. Within a week, he had identified through discreet channels that the guidebook to my itinerary was a man who had faced 2 previous complaints filed with the Yukon territorial government, both involving accidents on guided trips, both resulting in insurance payouts. Both ultimately closed without charges. The pattern was not provable in isolation, but it told us what we needed to know about the kind of man we were dealing with. Robert also helped me purchase a small body-worn audio recorder, the type used in professional investigations, that could run continuously for 18 hours on a single charge. He helped me identify a second guide, a man named Warren, semi-retired, who had guided the Teslin corridor for 20 years and whom Robert had located through a former colleague in Whitehorse. Warren agreed to join the trip as a fishing companion, for a fee I was glad to pay, with full understanding of the situation. He was a quiet and careful man, and when I spoke to him on the phone, he simply said, "I know that river. Nobody's going in it while I'm standing there." I also visited my attorney, a woman named Patricia, who had taken over my old practice and whom I trusted completely. I updated my will. I did not remove my son. Not yet. Not until I had evidence. But I added provisions, and I left a sealed letter with Patricia, explaining everything I knew. to be opened in the event of my death, by any cause, while in the Yukon. Patricia looked at me over her reading glasses for a long moment when I finished explaining. "You were always better at this than most," she said quietly. "I had a good teacher," I said, which was what she always said to me when I complimented her work. And she almost smiled. In the 2 weeks before I left, I behaved exactly as my son expected me to behave. I called him to say I was looking forward to the trip. I asked about the gear list. I had dinner with him and his wife, and I sat across the table from them and talked about the Teslin watershed and the fishing reports I had been reading. And I watched his wife's eyes while she smiled at me, and I felt something very cold and very settled in the center of my chest. I had spent 31 years sitting across tables from people who were not telling me the truth. I knew what it looked like. I left on a Tuesday morning from Hamilton on a connecting flight through Calgary to Whitehorse. My son drove me to the airport. He carried my bag to the check-in counter, and we stood together in the departures hall, and he put both hands on my shoulders, the way he used to when he was much younger, and told me to have a wonderful trip, and that he would be thinking of me. I told him I loved him. I meant it, which was perhaps the most painful part of the whole thing. I flew north. Warren met me at the Whitehorse Airport. He was a tall man, weathered in the particular way that people who spend their lives outdoors become weathered. Not aged exactly, but settled, like old timber. He shook my hand and looked at me directly and said nothing more than necessary, which I appreciated. We drove 2 hours to the staging point near Teslin Lake and set up camp that evening, while the guide, the man my son had hired, observed our arrival with an expression I had been trained over a career to read as careful recalculation. His name was listed on the itinerary as Boyd. He was in his mid-40s, competent-looking, with the easy confidence of someone accustomed to being the most capable person in any given outdoor situation. When Warren introduced himself as my fishing companion, Boyd's eyes moved between us once, quickly, and then went neutral. "More the merrier," he said. That first evening, I kept the recorder running and said very little. Warren cooked. Boyd sat by the fire and worked on his equipment and asked me questions about my life in Hamilton with the manner of a man who was establishing rapport. How long had I been retired? Did I have family? Had I been to the Yukon before? I answered everything honestly because I saw no reason not to, and because the truth about my life served my purposes better than any invented version of it. The first 3 days passed in a rhythm of early mornings, cold water, and long silences that the Yukon seems to generate as naturally as it generates weather. The fishing was extraordinary. I say this without exaggeration. As someone who had fished all his adult life, the Teslin in October moves with a particular gray-green clarity, cold enough that you feel it through your waders within minutes, and the Chinook that still ran that stretch were large and difficult and demanded real attention. I found, to my own surprise, that I was genuinely present for it in a way I had not expected to be. Boyd was a skilled guide. That was the uncomfortable truth of it. Whatever arrangements he had made with my son had apparently not disrupted his professional competence, and I found myself thinking, in unguarded moments, that under other circumstances I might have enjoyed his company. On the 4th day, Warren took a different section of the river, about 300 meters upstream as we had planned. He was close enough to reach me quickly if needed, but far enough that Boyd and I were effectively alone. I had been waiting for this. We were wading a gravel bar about midstream, working a deep run on the far bank, when Boyd moved up beside me and said quietly, "You ever think about what happens to all of this when we're gone?" I cast again before I answered. "To the river? It carries on." "I mean, your things," he said. "Your money. Who gets it?" I looked at him. "Why do you ask?" "Just making conversation." He smiled. It did not reach his eyes. "My estate is in order," I said. "Must be a lot," he said. "After a career like yours." The recorder was running. "Enough," I said. We fished in silence for another few minutes. The current pushed steadily against my waders. The recorder picked up everything, the water, the wind, the quiet, and then Boyd said, still looking at the river, "There's a section downstream I want to show you this afternoon. The bank drops off fast, and the current runs hard. Good holding water. You'll want to wade carefully." "I always wade carefully," I said. He nodded slowly. That evening, I replayed the recording through an earpiece and added my own notes in a small notebook I was keeping in my inside jacket pocket. Context, timestamps, tone. It was not a confession. But it was behavior, and behavior in a documented pattern has weight. On the sixth day, Boyd suggested the downstream section again, more specifically this time, and mentioned that the water had dropped enough to make wading very manageable. A description that, for anyone who knew that particular stretch, was a straightforward lie. Warren had walked it the previous afternoon and told me the drop-off was abrupt and the undertow was genuine. "A man goes in there alone," Warren said. "He is in serious trouble in October." I told Boyd I was happy to fish it. That morning, before we left camp, I made 2 phone calls, one to Robert, to confirm he was standing by, one to Patricia, to tell her I was well. We reached the downstream section around 10 in the morning. The sky was flat and gray, and the temperature was just above freezing. Warren positioned himself on the near bank under the pretense of photographing the river, which he did, in fact, do, producing an unbroken visual record of everything that followed. Boyd waded out ahead of me to show me the line, which is standard guiding practice, and when I followed, he moved progressively further from the near bank, steering me step by step toward the deeper water on the far side of the run. The recorder was running. The current was already pulling at my legs above the knee. "Just another few steps to the left," Boyd said. "That's where they're holding." I stopped where I was. "Boyd," I said. He turned. "My brother-in-law is a retired RCMP officer," I said. "He has been in contact with the Yukon RCMP detachment in Teslin since the day I arrived. They know where I am, who I'm with, and what I believe the purpose of this trip is. Warren has been filming this river section for the past 20 minutes. I've been recording every conversation since the morning of day 1. Boyd stood very still in the current. "I am 64 years old," I said. "I have spent my entire career in courtrooms. I know exactly what I have, and I know exactly what happens next. The question is whether you want to make it worse for yourself than it already is." The silence lasted perhaps 15 seconds, which is a very long time when you are standing in a cold river in the Yukon. Then Boyd said, "I want to talk to a lawyer." "That is," I said, "the first reasonable thing you have said all week." The Teslin RCMP detachment responded within 3 hours. Boyd was taken into custody at the camp. In the course of the initial interview, in which he cooperated fully and immediately, as men in his position often do when they realize the weight of the evidence against them, he provided a complete account of his arrangement with my son, including the amount he had been paid, the method of communication, and the specific plan for staging my death as an accident. The amount was $40,000. Half paid up front, half on completion. $40,000. I sat with that number for a long time after Robert told me over the phone that evening, not because it was small, though in some accounting it was, but because of what it said about how I was valued. Not even by a stranger. By my son. Robert called me again 2 hours later to tell me that my son and his wife had been arrested at their home in Toronto. His wife had attempted to delete communications from her phone, but had not understood that the messages had already been preserved on Boyd's device and through his service provider. The Crown Attorney, Robert told me, was describing it as one of the cleaner conspiracy cases she had seen in some time. I thanked Warren that night more thoroughly than I had words for. He told me not to worry about it and poured us both a cup of coffee, and we sat watching the northern sky and said very little else, which felt exactly right. I flew home 4 days later. The house on Ashford Road was quiet when I unlocked the door. I put my bag down and walked through the rooms slowly, the kitchen, the living room, the hallway where I had stood flat-handed against the wall and heard my son's voice arranging my death. The rooms looked the same light through the same windows, Margaret's photograph on the sideboard, as it had always been. I sat down at the kitchen table. I am not someone who grieves in a loud way. I never have been. My grief for Margaret had been quiet and long, the kind that works its way into the ordinary texture of daily life until you stop noticing where it ends and you begin. What I felt in those days after coming home was different from that. It had a sharper edge. a quality of severance, as though something had been removed cleanly, rather than worn slowly away. My son had grown up in this house. He had learned to walk in this hallway. He had sat at this table for 30 years of meals. All of that was still true. It was also true that he had paid a man $40,000 to let me drown in a river so that he and his wife could collect on my estate. Both things existed simultaneously, and I understood, as the weeks went on, that they would continue to exist simultaneously for the rest of my life. There was no version of this where one canceled the other out. A lawyer learns early that most of the world's real damage happens in exactly this way, not through the actions of strangers or monsters, but through the choices of ordinary people who wanted something and convinced themselves it was justified. I had the will formally revised. The estate went to a scholarship fund at McMaster University, established in Margaret's name, for first-generation law students. Patricia handled the paperwork and told me it was the best thing she had done all year. My son retained a defense attorney, as was his right. The preliminary hearing was set for late spring. I did not attend. I had given my statement to the Crown, and I would give my testimony in court when the time came, which I would do with the same composure I had brought to 31 years of difficult rooms. Robert came for a weekend in December, and we cooked dinner together and played cards until late, and at some point he asked me how I was doing, not in the way people ask that question when they expect a short answer, but in the way that Margaret's family had always asked it, which meant they genuinely wanted to know. I thought about it before I answered. "I'm here," I said. "That's more than they planned for." Robert nodded and we played another hand, and the wind came in off the lake the way it always does in December, rattling the old windows of the house where I had lived for most of my adult life. And I sat at the same table where my son had handed me that envelope, and I was grateful, genuinely, completely, without any performance to it, to still be sitting there at all. There is a particular kind of knowledge that comes from surviving something you were not supposed to survive. Not triumph, exactly. Not the clean satisfaction of winning. It is something quieter and more durable than that. It is the knowledge that the worst thing has already happened, and you are still here, still in possession of yourself, still capable of pouring a cup of tea and watching the light change over the lake and deciding, deliberately, what kind of person you want to be in whatever time you have left. I had not let them take that from me. That, in the end, was enough. There is a principle I came to understand long before any of this happened, one that 31 years of litigation had quietly confirmed for me in case after case. The choices a person makes do not stay contained to the moment they are made. They move outward. They return, not through magic, not through fate, but through the straightforward mechanics of cause and effect. The same logic that governs every contract, every broken promise, every courtroom I ever sat in. My son made a choice. He made it out of greed, or desperation, or some combination of the two that I may never fully understand. But the choice itself set everything else in motion. It required him to deceive. Deception required coordination. Coordination required trust in people who had their own reasons for cooperating and their own reasons for abandoning that cooperation the moment a better option presented itself. The entire structure was built on the assumption that I would be passive, that age and affection had made me soft enough to walk into a river without looking at what was downstream. That assumption was the first mistake. It was also, ultimately, the only one that mattered. I want to be honest about what I believe made the difference, because I think it matters more than the specific details of recorders and retired RCMP officers, and a good man named Warren standing on a riverbank in the Yukon. What made the difference was that I did not allow shock to become paralysis. When I stood on that side porch and felt the full weight of what I had heard, I had a choice of my own to make. I could collapse inward, into grief, into denial, into the kind of desperate hope that tells you must have misunderstood. Or I could think clearly, act deliberately, and refuse to let the people who had underestimated me continue to do so. Intelligence, in my experience, is not primarily about what you know. It is about what you do with what you know in the moments when everything in you wants to look away. It is the discipline of remaining clear-headed when clarity is the most difficult thing available to you. I had spent a career building that discipline. It turned out to be the most practical thing I owned. Integrity works the same way. It is not a quality that announces itself in comfortable times. It reveals itself in the places where compromise would be easier, where you could tell a smaller version of the truth, take a softer path, avoid the harder confrontation. I could have quietly changed my will and said nothing. I could have let my son believe he had frightened me into silence. Instead, I chose to do the thing that was more difficult and more complete, because I believed that a half measure would only postpone the reckoning, not prevent it. And the resilience, that came from somewhere I had not expected. It came from understanding that surviving betrayal is not the same as being unaffected by it. I was affected. I am still affected. But being affected and being defeated are entirely different things, and the distance between them is a choice that each person makes for themselves. In private, in the quiet rooms where no one is watching, Walter, the man I was, the man I remain, is still sitting at that kitchen table on Ashford Road. The light still comes through the same windows. The lake is still out there. And the life that someone tried to end is still, stubbornly, continuingly, mine. That is not a small thing. It is, in fact, everything.